On this Wednesday night, the brutal bombing of a maternity and children's hospital in Ukraine, the victims and devastation, and more pleas for the West to intervene.
The World War III is already begun.
New concerns about the old Chornobyl plant, the potential consequences of that facility losing its power supply. The changing face of the pandemic when Ontario will drop most of its mask mandates, and a new report on BC's overdose crisis, why thousands have died and is there a solution? Plus, a century-old mystery solved.
You can see her paintwork, you can see the bolt.
Where the search for this famous sunken ship finally ended.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
It is one of the darkest signs of the inhumanity of Russia's war on Ukraine. A heavily pregnant woman among the injured after a maternity and children's hospital took a direct hit. This massive crater in the hospital courtyard shows the impact of the strike. Good evening and thanks for joining us. Ukrainian authorities say 17 people have been injured. Among the first to post video of the devastation was Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky. It shows the hospital in ruins. Zelensky tweeted, "People, children are under the wreckage." Atrocity, he wrote. How much longer will the world be an accomplice ignoring terror? Close the sky right now. Stop the killings. You have power, but you seem to be losing humanity. This happened in Mariupol, a city that's been under siege for days by Russian forces who have surrounded it and cut off all supplies, food, and power. Crystal Goomansingh begins our coverage tonight, and a warning: some of the images in her story are graphic.
Workers were already calling the scene apocalyptic before this strike. Now it's a new level of terror. Expectant mothers had to be ushered out of what should have been a warm, safe place, as a children's hospital and maternity unit in Mariupol became one of the latest targets of Russian aggression. The frantic video of the scene tries to capture the scope of the devastation.
The hospital where I worked when I was a child is bombed.
Dmitry Ogurin is a Ukrainian politician from Mariupol. His parents are still in the besieged city. He's frustrated, saying there are many examples of Russian brutality with ongoing and deadly strikes on civilians, and demands to know what else needs to happen to force the world into action.
The World War III is already begun, and you have to understand where is your line. The maternity hospital in Ukraine, is it enough? Is our blood is red enough for you?
Red Cross volunteers are trying to help the vulnerable, but the port city is encircled by Russian forces. Nearly 500,000 people, mostly Russian speakers, are trapped. There's no heating, electricity, water, natural gas connections. In other words, there is nothing, no household commodities. A ceasefire was supposed to be in place here, allowing people a chance to find food or escape if they could. But for the second day, that promise of security was shattered.
Russia's relentless bombardment, including of civilians trying to flee, prevents people from safely escaping the hellish conditions that they've created.
The hellish conditions are expected to deteriorate. Gorin says starvation in the city will lead to more deaths, and there's no suggestion the bombings will stop. Crystal Goomansingh, Global News, London.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, along with senior ministers, were in Berlin today, continuing talks with NATO allies. They were asked about the attack on that maternity hospital and President Zelensky's repeated pleas for a no-fly zone. Here's what Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland said.
When I look at those pictures, I have to stop looking at them. It is an atrocity, what is happening in Ukraine. And I think a person would have to have a heart of stone to not be moved, and to not be moved by the appeals of President Zelensky. At the same time, we need to be very, very thoughtful around escalation. And that's the line that we're walking.
A no-fly zone, Freeland says, would cross that line. Abigail Bimman is traveling with the Canadian delegation in Berlin.
The historic Brandenburg Gate. A visit to a former train platform in Berlin where 50,000 Jews were taken to ghettos and death camps. Justin Trudeau reflects on the past while meeting with allies to try and stop what's happening in the present.
War is once again raging in the middle of Europe. For the first time since 1939, when my country started the Second World War,
democracy is always stronger than authoritarianism.
Trudeau began his day with a call with Ukraine's president, telling Volodymyr Zelensky Canada will send precision cameras for surveillance drones as part of a new $50 million equipment boost, while acknowledging getting all the aid Canada has previously promised across the border into Ukraine hasn't been easy.
Logistical challenges that are real but not insurmountable.
A different challenge, how to get European countries to move away from Russian oil and gas they depend on.
Wasserstoff.
Germany is interested in Canadian hydrogen as an alternative. Canada is interested too, but experts say we're still years away from being in a position to produce enough at home to send abroad.
We do need to just speed up our hydrogen facilities for production, storage, even shipping of hydrogen, so that we can enter these international low-carbon hydrogen markets as soon as possible.
Germany, meanwhile, has suspended Nord Stream 2, a major pipeline project for more Russian gas.
They are bearing enormous costs, and what they are prepared to do is an indication of what the West is prepared to do. So Germany is the most important country in this whole dilemma, and that is why Trudeau is there.
Another major move by Germany, reversing decades of pacifist policy in the wake of World War II, shipping weapons to Ukraine. The country has pledged to double its defense budget. Asked several times about Canada's defense spending, the Prime Minister left the door open, but wouldn't commit. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Berlin.
There are growing concerns tonight about two Ukrainian nuclear power plants. The largest facility is occupied by Russian forces who are reported to be holding employees captive and working them to exhaustion. And power has been cut to the closed Chornobyl nuclear facility. Mike Armstrong reports on what's at stake and what nuclear experts are watching for.
The International Atomic Energy Agency says there is no critical impact on safety right now, but that losing power at the defunct Chernobyl plant violates a fundamental safety precaution. The facility was seized by Russian troops in the first hours of the invasion. Now, Ukraine says power lines to the facility have been cut by fighting in the area. Emergency diesel generators have kicked in, but according to the Ukrainian Foreign Affairs Minister, they can only power the plant for 48 hours. In a tweet, he says, after that, cooling systems of the storage facility for spent nuclear fuel will stop, making radiation leaks imminent. The IAEA says for now there is enough water in the cooling reservoirs, but it also confirms its access to sensors at the facility has been cut. This Canadian nuclear expert says he trusts the UN agency, but he'd like it to be there.
They should be allowed into the facility and all the facilities in the Ukraine so that we do have an expert and independent voice on these issues. And it seems like that communication has been cut off, which is disturbing in itself.
Now, there are also developments with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Russia attacked and seized that facility last Friday, the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. Ukraine's energy minister is accusing Russian troops of holding the staff hostage.
Russia propaganda machine.
He also claims the staff is being forced to participate in a video that's being produced to depict everything as being fine. The Russian Foreign Ministry, meantime, says its troops seized the facilities to prevent Ukrainian nationalists and terrorists from causing a nuclear problem. Now, of the two, the Zaporizhzhia plant is more modern and less likely to be a problem in terms of radiation leaks. Chernobyl is older, but it does have two containment structures over it. The last one was put in place just 6 years ago. Experts say if there was a problem, it shouldn't be as serious as it would have been without those containment structures. It wouldn't spread as widely, but it could be a real problem for staff. Donna?
Mike Armstrong in Lviv, Ukraine. Thanks. In the U.S., the Pentagon says Russia has fired more than 700 missiles at Ukrainian targets in the last 2 weeks. It says Ukraine's ground defenses, including surface-to-air missiles, have helped hold back Russian advances. And the U.S. has rejected an offer by Poland to transfer its 28 MiG fighters to an American airbase in Germany so they could be sent into Ukraine. The Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby says that has been deemed too high risk.
The transfer of combat aircraft right now could be mistaken by Mr. Putin and the Russians as an escalatory step. Should this conflict escalate even further, but it's certainly not going to be good for the Ukrainian people to have what is already a destructive and terrible war get even more destructive and terrible.
Over 2 million people have fled Ukraine, many to neighboring nations, including Moldova. That country declared a state of emergency and closed its airspace when Russia invaded Ukraine, and it opened its borders to refugees. Moldova, a former Soviet republic between Ukraine and Romania, is home to 2.6 million people. It's not a NATO or European Union member, though Moldova's president has applied to join the EU. 20 years ago, Russian-backed separatists took control of a region called Transnistria, where about 1,500 Russian troops are stationed. And at the easternmost point of Moldova, tens of thousands of Ukrainians are flooding across a border crossing into the country. Mercedes Stevenson is there.
We're here on the Ukrainian side of the border, so this is actually Ukraine, and what you're seeing here is refugees who are crossing the border. They are going to walk across into Moldova. Thousands of people are doing this every day. It is bitterly cold. It is windy. People are waiting in line for hours. Many have walked a long way. There are mostly women and children and the elderly who are crossing. There are also some men, like the men that you see behind me here. These men are fighting age, so usually they would have to stay behind, but these particular men are looking for political asylum in Moldova. So they will be crossing and hoping that they are allowed to leave the country. But by far the vast majority of people who we're seeing here are women with young children and the elderly. Very difficult wait. Certainly in the tent behind us there is food, there is hot soup, but it is so difficult for the people that have made this journey. Physically, emotionally, people we've been talking to who say bullets narrowly missed them, that they have gone from city to city that is being bombed, basically dodging their way through Ukraine across roads that are no longer passable to find their way to this point. They have no idea where they're going to go after this. There is a quiet strength among these Ukrainians as they wait, but the trauma is etched on their faces. You can feel the anxiety of the life they knew suddenly interrupted by war, and the urgency of their need to get to safety as they anticipate a renewed assault on nearby Odessa. Mercedes Stevenson, Global News, at the Polanka border crossing in Ukraine.
A major shift in public health restrictions coming up when Ontario will drop most of its mask mandates. Ontario has become the latest province to announce a roadmap to end all COVID-19 public health restrictions. As of March 21st, masks will no longer be required in the majority of indoor settings, including schools and large event spaces. Most isolation requirements for close contacts are also being dropped.
The lifting of public health and workplace safety measures and the end of weekly updates does not signal that COVID-19 has disappeared or that the pandemic is over. What it means is that we have come to a place where we know what we need to do to manage this virus.
Masks are still required in high-risk settings like hospitals and public transit, though Ontario says the plan is to lift all mandates on April 27th. Most provinces are moving to end mask mandates. Alberta and Saskatchewan did so at the beginning of March. Manitoba, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick and Newfoundland have all laid out plans to do so in the coming days and weeks. Quebec has begun phasing them out in schools but hasn't announced a broader plan. BC and PEI are the only provinces not to have announced their plans. A new report is urging British Columbia to expand its safer drug supply to prevent more overdose deaths. A panel reviewed more than 6,000 deaths between August 2017 and July 2021. It found the primary cause of death was the increasingly toxic illicit drug supply. The report calls for a safer drug supply and the development of action plans to better monitor the crisis. Drug toxicity is the leading cause of unnatural death in British Columbia. More than 8,700 people have died since the province declared a public health emergency back in 2016. A sad update to a landmark medical case. The first person to receive a heart transplant from a genetically modified pig has died. American David Bennett passed away 2 months after his historic surgery. The 57-year-old had terminal heart disease. He knew the procedure was risky, a shot in the dark, he called it. The hospital did not provide an exact cause of death, but said he began to deteriorate several days ago. His family thanked them for offering the experimental transplant. They hope it will help future research. Ahead, as countries ban Russian oil, environmentalists make a push to turn to greener energy for good. Canada, the U.S. and the European Union have committed to reducing or completely banning the import of Russian oil and gas. There is going to be an immediate need to replace that supply, but there's also pressure to use this moment to push for a faster transition to green energy. Anne Gaviola explains.
Environmental lawyer Phil Pothin has been a longtime advocate for a shift away from car culture.
As if we needed another wake-up call.
The pandemic shift to remote work and virtual meetings have some people rethinking daily commutes and in-person business trips. And now, with the war in Ukraine forcing a re-evaluation of the world's reliance on Russia, he thinks this could be steps towards a larger shift.
There's a confluence of things that are happening all at once that are going to cause this change to stick this time.
Global gas prices have soared above $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014. Tuesday, on the heels of the U.S. ban on Russian oil, Russia warned a European ban could lead to an unpredictable surge and that oil at $300 a barrel or more could be in the making.
But what this conflict clearly shows is how dangerous our dependence on a fossil fuel system is.
Analysts say an energy inflation spiral could squeeze consumers and businesses and push Europe, Latin America, and eventually North America and China into a recession. The Alberta Regional Director for the Pembina Institute says Canada needs to urgently address what he calls the climate crisis, or we risk falling further behind countries like China in the global green shift.
The amount of renewable energy production that's happening there and electric vehicles is really dramatic. They're becoming a global leader in these technologies.
Expanding our reliance on oil and gas increases our vulnerability. It accelerates climate change, the fires and the floods that are already costing us billions and displacing millions of people worldwide.
Environmentalists say there's a strong strategic, moral, and business case for moving away from fossil fuel dependence. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Patience has paid off for a team searching for one of history's greatest shipwrecks. Explorer Ernest Shackleton's ship Endurance has been found beneath Antarctic ice 106 years after being crushed by ice. An expedition spent weeks searching the remote location and made the discovery using state-of-the-art underwater technology. It is 3,000 meters below the surface, upright, and, according to the team's director, in remarkably good shape.
The wood is as fresh as the day the ship went down. You can see her paintwork, you can see the bolts, you can see the ship's name, Endurance, curved across her stern, and beneath it the great five-pointed star.
The ship sank in 1915, forcing Shackleton and his 27-man crew to escape on foot and in small boats. It was a 10-month ordeal to safety. He was trying to become the first to cross Antarctica via the South Pole. He failed, but his journey is still considered one of the most epic feats of endurance in Antarctic exploration. Endurance is now protected as an historic site under the Antarctic Treaty. Next, how the war in Ukraine could make a global hunger crisis even worse. Russia's attack on Ukraine is taking place in a region often called the breadbasket of Europe. Both countries produce grain that many other countries rely on, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. Redmond Shannon explains what the war, if it's prolonged, could do to food supplies for millions of people.
Ukrainian refugees have fled, often without knowing where their next meal will come from. Inside the country's besieged cities, food is running out. A tragic irony in a part of the world long known as the breadbasket of Europe. Ukraine and Russia are huge producers and exporters of grains and oilseeds, but many Ukrainian farmers have left the fields to fight, and Black Sea ports are closed.
Right now, knowing how much Black Sea actually matters in the scale of the international grain export, it's going to be very, very and very bad.
The war has strangled supply, with the price of wheat and sunflower seeds breaking records.
And about 80% of sunflower oil comes from these two countries. So the impact of this crisis is worldwide.
This is a disaster for struggling countries close to Ukraine. Lebanon, where the economy is already in tatters, gets most of its wheat from there. War-torn Yemen, where hunger is already a huge problem, relies heavily on affordable grain imports. The ripple effects could soon be felt even more strongly, according to this Ukrainian trade expert.
It's not just some local Ukrainian-Russian war. And if you don't want to have another refugee crisis from those areas which will be underfed, this is something that the world needs to do. We need a way of ending this.
The World Food Programme says the war compounds the effect of COVID-19, climate change and other conflicts. It says 44 million people are already on the edge of famine, and that could rise further unless it gets more funds. Better still would be an end to this and other wars. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
That is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. In Ukraine's capital city today, an orchestra assembled for an open-air concert. We leave you tonight with some of their music. The Kiev Classical Symphony Orchestra set up in Maidan Square, and among the songs they played was Ukraine's national anthem. The lyrics, translated to English, say, "The glory and freedom of Ukraine has not yet perished. Our enemies will vanish like dew in the sun." Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow.